Hi, everyone. Good evening. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Introduction to the Human Lifecycle of DAM. This is the first in our 4-webinar series on the human side of DAM. I'm Sarah Brailowski, Chair of the San Jose State University School of Information Chapter of ASIS&T. We're very lucky to have this great session put on by 3 thought leaders in DAM. We have Jill Talvansari, a senior marketing leader, executive coach, nonprofit board member, and digital experience industry expert. Kathleen Cameron, who is the digital asset manager of global marketing ops at Google, and who has a professional interest in the digital asset lifecycle management. Also presenting, but traveling at the same time, so she might be in and out, is Robin Parise, media therapist who helps senior Fortune 500 leaders simplify complex technology and processes for continuous growth and success. Before I give it away to our presenters tonight, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation. As questions pop up, go ahead and enter them into the chat window, and the speakers will address them in a Q&A at the end of the session. We do have a few interactive surveys that we'll launch as pop-ups during the presentation. If you're connecting on anything with a screen, we encourage you to participate in those. And at that, I will give it away to our presenters.
Hey there, we're happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So to get started, why don't we go ahead, and I know you've introduced all of us, and so without further ado, let's go to the agenda. So tonight with you all, we're going to have a hopefully very interactive conversation. So we want you to go ahead and put questions in the chat window as we go here, and we'll try to address them and get into some really meaty topics. This first one of the sequence of 4 is very focused on the human life cycle of DAM. So we're going to go through why DAM projects by their very nature are change management. We'll talk about the human life cycle and what all of the different humans are that we encounter and get to work with. Some strategies for success to help you be consistently successful, not only in your first year, but years 5 and onwards as well. And then how to engage with key stakeholders. And there's different ways depending on the motivations and level of stakeholder that we're talking about, as well as the way they interact with the system. And then community and feedback loops, different ways to get everything from power users to internal business sponsors, working with agencies and external vendors, and the best way to do that. Tips for effective communications with all of the above, and then why DAM is never done. So DAM is change management. So we don't want to scare you, because human beings by nature do not love change, and we all know this as we've tried to install new systems for people to use in any part of the creative operations lifecycle. But we also know that success requires us to have change management built in, because the scope and charter we start out with won't necessarily be the vision we end up with, and we need a process and a way to proactively handle that. And that's what change management really is just proactively handling everything from a difficult conversation to a new business strategy that we need to take into account. And secondarily, implementing new technologies and businesses are inherently at the core of digital transformation. And if you already have new systems in place, you've already installed one DAM, I can guarantee you will be enhancing it, optimizing, and scaling it in no time, which means you're constantly doing digital transformation.
So we often need to address the change by reminding people of what they already know. So we start off with a simple workflow diagram. This is a basic process that most of us go through, where we know that we have activities happening at the concept level, all the way through to creation, processing, and distribution. So by identifying that, it makes the change a little bit less scary for people. So we can start with what we know, and then at the beginning of the process, and also acknowledge what the end of the process is. And that really helps inform a lot of the decisions that we make around DAM. And what we want to do in trying to diagram this out is convince people that the change is not going to be scary, and we're trying to align them as humans with the technology and the process that the technology is supporting. So we break this down sort of in traditional project management terms as to who are the key stakeholders. So you always want to have an executive sponsor, and that's the person probably sitting pretty high up the ladder that has budget approval and can also help champion this at the top level, because you always want top level support. We also have content creators who also can be consumers, but they're the people responsible for the creation of the content. And we want to acknowledge what their process is, because they tend to generate a lot of data that we will want to capture once we get to the dam. And then we want to acknowledge the consumers, the people that are accessing the data, the people that are searching, retrieving, sharing that out, repurposing it for reuse, because they have a very different user experience. And most importantly, you cannot forget about yourselves, the administrators of the tool. You need to be able to acknowledge who your stakeholders are and how you can best support them, because it's a pretty broad stakeholder group that we're usually engaged with. And we want to be mindful of that, but we also want to be mindful of what we are capable of supporting. Sometimes we're sole contributors, we can support much less. Sometimes we can then advocate for teams and then support a lot more.
Do you think any of these stakeholders are more important than the others? Like if you had to rank order, who's the most important voice and loudest to listen to? What do you think, Kathleen?
Probably the content creators, because they play two roles. They're creating the content, they need to manage the content. Sometimes that's managing the content along with rights, so they have a lot more stake in the game. Plus, they're also consumers. So they, because of that duality of their role, I think that they tend to be primary stakeholders.
Agreed. I think gut level always says to me who's paying the check is the one that I think is most important. But really, most executive sponsors I've worked with over the years, when they understand the impact of the system to the content creators and how they're going to save money and time, both from search as well as not having to recreate and all of the other myriad benefits of a dam, they quickly get on the side of the creators. Absolutely.
Yeah. And often what I found is it's the executive sponsor reaching out to a content creator saying, I need something for a slide deck right away. And then the content creators are on the hook for finding it immediately. And that's where there's that alignment between those two roles, where one is supporting the other. And that's where DAM plays a critical role in the content creator can now find that content very quickly, acknowledge whether or not they've got the rights to even share it with the executive sponsor. Not that the executive sponsor will hear the word no, but we've all been in that situation where, you know, there's a fire drill late at night. And so that's where the executive sponsor can then say, this really is working. They got it to me really fast.
Exactly. Do you think, so at a huge level, if you think of a large company like Apple, I think the last I heard they had 72,000 partners worldwide that had to have access to their branded assets. So
Mm-hmm.
that's an extreme example. But where do you think it's going? Because being part of Google and that they're known for having a lot of in-house. How do you think in-house agency versus external agency? It used to be that the external agency would drive what dam and what systems were being used, and it feels like brands are now driving it, the companies themselves. What are you seeing happen?
I'm hearing from a lot of colleagues that the brands are pretty much driving this now. So
Mm-hmm.
that there are point of contacts within the company, whether or not you have an in-house agency model within your company, or you're working with outside agencies, or you have a hybrid model. These roles still seem to come into effect. So you may have people creating the content from a design level internally, handing it off to be produced to an agency, and then the agency hands it back. The agency is still a part of that creation process. But the agencies are also consumers, because they're looking for materials to build new marketing stuff with, right?
Right.
So it kind of, it floats both ways. I think the agencies, depending on how people are interacting with them in a marketing org, can also play those dual roles.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. They fall in here too.
Yeah, but I'm also finding agencies aren't managing content via dams. They're relying on their whoever's contracting with them to have a management system in place.
Right, so they become more of a client of the system, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
which is an interesting switch.
Yeah, it is. It's also terrifying to think that, you know, all these big companies are working with agencies who aren't really managing your content. And that's where we come in, right? It's like, please give it to us immediately. Yeah, it's an interesting change.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to go ahead and launch our first poll and we can see where people's current experiences are with DAM?
Sure, let me get that up.
So we're looking for how many projects, how many of you are currently working with DAM and data projects, and how many of you have done it in the past but aren't currently, or just not at all right now? And Sarah, I think you're the only one that can see the results if you want to share with us the mystery.
Yeah, as soon as I hit end, it will take it away. So let me see, we're at 72% completed. I'm going to go ahead and end it.
Oh, cool. So about third, so really evenly split. So about a third have, nobody has done it in the past. So you either have or you have not. So you're going to learn a lot of fun stuff tonight that will help you in any kind of IT project you're involved in. And do you want to go ahead and run the second poll too?
Sure.
So when does change management start during the DAM lifecycle? Hint, you've already heard this, but beginning, middle, end, all of the above. This is the test if you were listening or came in a couple minutes late, I think. Where did we end up?
We're at 63%. It slowed right down. I'll go ahead and end it.
All right, all of the above, and definitely in the beginning. So I think what most of you would find pretty interesting is, even though we said it's change management, the vast majority of companies don't have a formal change management process for nearly anything going on at the company, let alone their IT projects. And yet, I'm sure you've been learning that a large majority of IT projects can fail, anywhere between 50 to 80%, depending on the type of project. And with numbers like that, you would think that we would build in as many stopgaps as possible. And yet, as human beings, we're consistently, I think, positive, you know, the glass is half full, that we're going to be successful, we can work anything out, and we will be triumphant in the end. But really, it needs a change management process, not only at the beginning, but also the middle, end, and ongoing with any kind of data project.
And even if your organization doesn't have a change management process in place, you can implement one for this program. You don't have to wait for the organization to catch up, but in order for you to guarantee success of launching a DAM or maintaining one, you can put a change management process in place.
And it doesn't have to be overly complicated. Do you have any ideas you can share about what one might look like, just briefly?
You know, I find it's easiest to start with sort of a basic project plan, quite honestly, and you state what you think success looks like and clearly state what's in scope and out of scope. For example, I don't collect everything. I collect a certain subset of the content that's generated, and I explain why. So it's a little bit like having a collection plan in place. And then make sure that you've got sign off from everyone on your plan, and then make sure there's a communication plan as part of that. But as much of the process as you can plot out, whether or not you're deploying a new DAM or you're refreshing or you're revamping a training program, you can start that change management process by just setting some goals around what you think success looks like.
Right. And if you're in the middle of heated discussions around, can't we launch next month? Why do you need all these features? What can we cut? And so when you start having scope conversations, the minute you start hearing scope, be thinking change management.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean the answer has to be yes, no, or maybe. It depends, and let's talk about scope.
Yeah, and Jill, don't you find that it doesn't really matter how large the project is, the same factors kind of come into play, right?
It really does. The stakes just get higher when you're either a strategically highly visible project, or sometimes you end up with a change in your executive sponsor, things like that
Yes.
can make things a little more heated.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But generally speaking, you can just expect change with IT because the technology changes so rapidly. That's what keeps us all interested in being part of this. Is it's exciting to be part of new tech and
Yes,
things that make
exactly.
right.
But having some of this, documented in the event that you have a change in executive sponsorship really will help continue to support the program in your organization.
It's also like a check and balance. I mean, this sounds a little bit police-ish, but one aspect that I always liked about change management and having, especially if you can get like a steering committee in place or you have a decision-making chart, so it's very clear who has the final ability to make the decision, who gets to stay informed, who gets to have an opinion but not make the final decision. For people to be very clear on where they fall within the organization on their ability to enact change versus make a decision about change is key. And then beyond that, there's the checks and balances piece of it, where if I want to make big changes, but I'm trying to push them through by just being, really strongly worded about it with everyone I encounter, if that's not my jurisdiction, at least if there's a documented process, we can actually go to someone else and say, hey, this needs to be stopped or it's going to derail us for 6 months and we can't launch, and then get feedback or that type of thing. So it forces a checks and balances when you have, lots of strong personalities and different types of folks that might be working on it.
Yeah, and it kind of maintains some focus. Should we
Absolutely.
talk through success strategies? Sarah,
Absolutely.
can we go to the
Yeah.
next one? So I think the key thing to remember is you shouldn't be doing this alone. This involves a lot of humans. You want to involve them as early and often as possible. You want a communication strategy so that people in the org know what you're doing. It continues to add value to what you're bringing when you're deploying a dam. It creates, buyer trust and buy-in, and just builds stakeholder confidence when you're engaging often. You also want to build a culture around it. Once people know it's there, you're going to become incredibly popular. So, capitalize on that. And to what Jill was saying before, you want to establish a governance board, so a steering committee or a group of critical stakeholders that have input. Often I look at people from different business units across the org so that everyone feels like they have some representation. I will go to them for everything from requirements to advice on user training with their teams to, is the taxonomy in the right place or do we need to make adjustments? There's different ways that you can set this up, but you want those people to feel like they're participating and have a say. So this is, back to, communicating frequently and often. And then that tends to drive results because then people are trusting you, they're trusting the content, and they feel like they've got some ownership and skin in the game.
Do we want to talk a little bit about different types of communications and things like so for example, one of my favorite things is having groups of power users. These are your passionate advocates. And like Kathleen said, you really want this as you're announcing the new project, having lunch and learns. If you can do a pilot program with the team that is most hungry for the technology that you're rolling out, get them completely onboarded and working really well, you're going to have people knocking down your door to get it rolled out to their area too, is what happens usually then.
Yeah, you want to pick the team that's most likely to adopt it immediately, who can then champion it, right? Sort of the low-hanging fruit concept.
And then when you think about the minimum viable product, you really do just want the feature set of exactly what they need. You don't want to overwhelm that first group. Very definitely, as other teams and functional areas come to you and ask to have it rolled out to their area too, because, you know, we're involved with these guys, they'll tell you. They will want new features and functionality, and that's your exact opportunity to turn those pieces on, and that kind of becomes a mini pilot that just spreads. And as the good word spreads, though, you're also going to start to have folks say, oh, I liked my old system better, or there's going to be some
Yes.
naysayers. And so you want to harness positivity when you're first rolling it out and get those people on board as your power users, your user feedback group. Train the trainer. You're going to want to have an expert within each functional area that can be their first line of defense. So if you think about a tiered service level agreement, if you will, with your organizations, you'll want someone that's on their teams to be the first person they go to. Then they escalate to probably you if you're the admin or responsible for the system. And then third level might be up to the manufacturer of the software itself.
Yeah, I think having those champions is critical, especially if you're a sole contributor within the organization. You need those people, and they're going to be your critical allies, really, to help champion this across the org. I find that communicating, especially in a large org, has its challenges. But what I've heard is that people want a weekly newsletter, and that can be sent through email, and about half the people in the org read it and half don't, and maybe 10% will comment back, but as soon as you don't send it, they wonder where it went. I have also done scheduled participating in quarterly team meetings where I ask for 10 minutes and I just check in with the whole team, and you know what's working, what's not working, and then make adjustments and tell them what's new or what's coming. You know, if you have an all hands meeting within your organization and you can get on that calendar at least once or twice a year, that's amazing, because you hit a very big audience at that point. Plus, it makes your executive sponsor look good if you are willing to go and speak in front of a big audience. So think in terms of having to communicate on a lot of different channels in order to reach the larger base.
Definitely. The other tactics I've tried along with those are if the vendor is a well-known one and offers enterprise level training, I'll bring them
Yeah.
in for a 1 or 2 hour lunch and learn. And I'm always surprised at how many people are dying to improve their skill set. And it's a tool that they use all the time.
Yes.
Also being able to offer online training that's easy to find. Maybe if you have an internal interweb that they can find it on is always really great too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. People seem to like short video snippets. I tend to do 30 seconds or less because they just want a quick reminder on good search strategies, or a quick reminder on how do I download, or how do I create a collection, or how do I do this. They don't want to have to look through 5-10 minutes worth of video to get to that one little snippet. So I find just posting those snippets has been huge, at least for my community.
Definitely. I think the one other hint I would have is if you can turn off the old system and migrate all of the data all at once in a bang,
Yes.
do that. Don't ever make it so they can go back. I mean, obviously have a rollback plan for safety from an IT security perspective, but don't tell the users that. Just we're moving forward. This is it.
Yes. Yes. Don't
Yeah.
give them too many options.
Yeah, embrace your new world. Here it is.
Exactly. Yeah. Rip the Band-Aid off, as it were.
Should we go to the next one?
Yeah.
So how we engage with our humans. We started to get into this a little bit already, but I think this provides a broad view. Do you want to go ahead and kind of give us a broad picture, Kathleen, and then I want to jump into things like accountability and oversight?
Sure. So this is another way to look at who your users are, right? Again, your executive sponsors are providing guidance and money usually. You should have a steering committee. We often forget about the importance of that, and making sure that that is representative across all your business units. Acknowledge who your project leads are. Sometimes these are project managers, sometimes they're producers. It depends on the kind of organization you're in. But these are the people that are generating the content. And maybe they're point of contact for an agency, or a video producer, or an external photographer, but they're usually your internal point of contact for getting the content and the metadata associated with the content. And then your core users are basically everyone else. And mostly those are people that are just using the system to try to find things. Sometimes it's going to be just for a deck, and sometimes it's going to be reused for something else, like Times Square takeover. You just want to acknowledge that search and discovery is a huge part of what these tools do. And we sometimes forget because we're in the tools all the time and we just think it's second nature, but it is not second nature to everyone. So it's important to check in with sort of the general user population to make sure that they're able to discover the content they want, and get more relevant results.
Yeah, even doing usability testing, or
Yes.
occasionally we would run surveys to find out how it's working for folks, and across different functionalities as well, right?
Yeah, and I think you can even gamify it. I have
Mm.
tried designing a treasure hunt for people and challenging them during a team meeting, like everyone open your computers and see if you can find this or that, and making
It's
it a
fun.
game, and then maybe they get, a little treat or something. But try to make it fun, because most people, again, back to change management, just find it tedious and they immediately shut down. But if you can kind of bring joy to the experience and lessen the worry that they're going to have to learn a whole new system, then that goes a long way.
For sure. And going back to the idea that you might be a lone wolf within your organization that's entirely responsible for the creative ops workflow or the digital asset management system and the administration, I don't want to forget to talk about all of the outside help and inside help that's available to you. So
Yes.
I'm starting with requirements and figuring out what the functionality needs to be, what assets need to be in there, and who the users are. Planning things like an all-day or even several separate all-day offsites with the key folks that will be using it to do everything from design what your metadata is going to look like to automating as much of what goes in for that metadata as possible. The less you're having people type in anything about their assets, the much more successful your future searches and your findability will be.
Yes.
Some of the things I've heard that work really well for these offsites, and Kathleen, I know you've run some as well. Anything from using like design thinking. I've heard of one in Europe that they use in Sweden called Stinky Fish. And it's fun in that you actually give people time to vent about what they hated about the old system, what went wrong with the last project, and you give them space to air it out. And normally, we might call it a postmortem, but normally we consider that to be super negative. Like, hey, we're embarking on this new project, aren't we all excited? But well, no, we've all done this 3 or 4 times before. This is our 8th new version of one of these that we have to use. Especially like a customer success organization, they may have anywhere from 5 to 14 different tools they're running. So this is old hat for them. It's just one more inconvenience. So, letting them get over the old one, let go of those feelings, and embracing the new one has a lot to be said for it. So Stinky Fish, design thinking, what else is there?
Yeah, I've used both of those and they're really great. So much of it is letting people vent. A big part of what we do is listening. So I really think when you're in high school, they should make you take social, social, socialist, not socialist. What am I trying to say? Um, Anyways, psych classes at a minimum, so that, because you end up being a therapist for a certain part of this, which is key, because you need to have good listening skills, right? You want people to say what's not working, get it out of their system, so that then they can focus on what they need. Because often people kind of choke up when you ask, what's your workflow? And it's hard for them to talk about it because they're in the day to day. So you have to use icebreakers and different tools to get them to relax enough to be able to articulate. Stinky Fish is one. A lot of ideation exercises are, rapidly put ideas on Post-it notes and let's put them up on a wall and then notice where all the commonality are, so we've used that a lot in terms of trying to define fields within a DAM. We also ask, what does the end state need to look like? Not just what's happening at the beginning, but what happens at the end. What is the critical data that needs to be reported out on for your VP? In my early career, I never thought about that. And then by the time somebody's asking for a report, I didn't have the data fields necessary to report out on that data. So that's where it's important to look at the end-to-end processes, but ask, you know, how often is somebody asking you for information, and what kind of information are they asking for? I do find that the word report makes people's brains shut down too. So I don't know if you've had that experience.
No,
It's
I
very
have.
funny.
People don't want to think about reports, but they do
No.
want to think about metrics that we're all going to be measured
Yes,
on for
exactly.
success. So I love to ask the question at the beginning of any kind of project or initiative that I'm involved in is, you know, a year from now when we look back, how will we know we were successful? And I mean that in the plainest terms. I'm not talking
Yes.
about a 1% increase in our engagement and 2% in the, you know, you start with our customers will be more engaged, we'll have lower turnover and retention, you know, and just those key things, and then you can start to put numbers to it.
Yes.
The other most embarrassing thing, though, is when your senior staff asks for the report that they were always able to get out of the old system and no one remembered to move the data or collect it in the new system. That's
Right.
always sad and not a fun answer to give back. We've got some questions here in the chat. We've got Joshua Gray saying that he sees parallels between project management institutes, PMBOK standards in terms of managing relationships and communication with stakeholders. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a great call out. Thanks, Joshua. There's a lot of correlation between change management and how you're deploying a dam. It basically is all project management. So if you've got some project management skills, or you've gone to PMI and done some of their workshops or the certification, that's going to help you in the long run.
For sure. And back to the point about why you would do these offsites and, you know, stinky fish and design thinking or ideation with sticky notes, whatever you're doing. The bottom line to that is that you're trying to establish excellent requirements up front. If you spend more time doing your requirements up front, I've heard, you know, even up to 40% of the effort of the project, not necessarily of the timeline. If you spend that up front, and you're able to get the right system in, possibly the right vendor, as well as you may want a systems integrator to help you integrate it into other parts of your MarTech stack. Picking the right people to be involved with, surrounding yourself with intelligent people that get this and have a proven track record, your chances for success are way, way higher.
Yeah. There's another question from Kathleen B. Does gamification help in introducing new digital tools or assets to the public in a library setting? And I would say absolutely. I've done it in a higher ed library setting several times, and it's been hugely successful. So it's not so much that we invited the public or in higher ed students, sometimes faculty, sometimes students on a committee, to participate in those discussions about what their needs are, because in the end, we're trying to meet the needs of other people and we're providing a service. So that's where you can make it fun through gamification, because it sort of breaks down barriers, and it gets people's creative juices flowing. It's a great way to do it. Yeah.
I also think if you take a step back and think about people's learning, I mean, obviously everybody has a different style of learning, and gamification usually taps into everything from visual and auditory and all of our senses, which is an excellent side to it. But the real thing, whenever you're thinking about training, whether it's a train the trainer model or whatever model you're using, the important thing about the people you're trying to get to adopt and teach, and teach themselves about something, is they have to believe that they can learn it. It has absolutely nothing to do, I mean, obviously you have to have a capability to learn it, but learning outcomes are much more determined by people believing that they can learn it and that they will have competency in it versus actual ability.
Yes.
So
making it accessible, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Breaking down those fears.
Yeah, and that's actually, let's talk about listening for just a second here, which I think segues nicely to our next slide. But, there's 3 levels of listening. And first level is when, Kathleen, if you're telling me about your weekend and you went to a nice restaurant, and I'll think, oh, maybe I'd like to go try that restaurant. So I'm thinking about how it affects me. And that's first level listening. Second level listening is when I'm listening to your story about your weekend, and maybe you had a dispute with we're going to say waiter over something at the dinner. And I'm thinking, oh, I wonder how you felt about that. Or did that impact the waiter's tip? Or, I'm thinking about you at that point. That's second level listening. Where you want to be to hear systems requirements and other things and not to miss the nuances of integration points and other things is third level listening. And that's when I'm not only hearing how it impacted you and I'm thinking about that, but I'm noticing changes on your face, your body language. Are you tightening up? Are you becoming smaller because someone else across the room got really loud all of a sudden and shut everyone else down? So now we're not hearing requirements from people anymore because someone who had a power differential with the other folks in the room, either because they have a louder voice or literally are superior to them, shut down what was a productive conversation. So learning ways to listen for that and cue in, and then be able to change the to shift the space of the room back to a more, I'm going to call it a sacred space, but basically a safe space where people can honestly share exactly what they're going to need to be able to get their work done and be effective is really crucial to gathering all of the requirements. And then that's continuously going on after we've launched our system too, because we're optimizing and changing all the time.
I'm going to say yes. And it isn't really a game of Twister, right? So it's that acknowledgement. It's that acknowledgement that you're not alone, that they're not alone, and that you have to respond to each other in order for this to be successful.
Yeah, and then I can't emphasize enough, it's engage early and often.
Yes. And the active listening piece, right? That not just thinking about your part or, you know, their part, but how those need to come together.
Right.
It's critical. And those are skills that are hard to teach too, right?
Totally all learnable though.
Yep. Yep, exactly.
I mean,
and it's a practice.
Yes, good listening is a practice.
Yeah.
Any tips you have for creating the type of offsite or space so that people feel like they can really show up with all of their needs and wants in the new system?
So when I've done it, I've tried to find a neutral space, right? Neutral ground. And that seems to work best because then people can't run to their desks. You ask them to put phones and computers away. You give breaks. You set an agenda ahead of time so they know when they can go check their phones or their computers. But you ask them to commit to a set period of time. And then that is more successful because then they're in a focused space. And then you make it safe, right? And then you have to have some fun activities, again, to sort of break down the thinking barriers that they're going to bring in because they're preoccupied with their day-to-day jobs. So you have to be a little bit creative. There are lots of icebreakers and games available if you do a web search. And keep the momentum going. It's got to be fast. Always start your meetings with music. And then keep the energy going. Things can happen in a really short amount of time. If you think the average television commercial is 30 seconds to a minute, and sometimes it tells an entire story, it is possible to get people to think really fast. You don't want them to overthink. So you have to think in terms of speed so that they're just coming right off the cuff with what is sort of top of mind.
Yeah, I've also seen it be really helpful if you create, once you're ready to kind of diagram it out together, if you give everybody a different job with a different color, or maybe I don't care if it's a whiteboard, but you actually diagram out the whole thing and you agree on it together, because what each person heard or experienced that we thought we all said we wanted, you'll leave the room and then it'll turn out you all said different things.
Yes, exactly. So it's important to validate that somehow.
Exactly.
But and then also don't worry that you have to find stakeholders on your own. So if you're in a public or an academic library setting, there are lots of committees that already exist. So you tap into those and start to build your stakeholders from that. If you're in a corporation, then you start with your manager and their manager, and then figure out who your key stakeholders are. This isn't something you do in isolation. You don't want to do any of this in isolation, but figure out who to partner with to get you that information. And then it starts to build pretty quickly from there.
Exactly. I think something else we wanted to touch on was, well, on the communication side, asking open-ended questions. Like from the design thinking
Yes.
world, it's the yes and. You don't shut anyone
Yes.
down.
Yeah, you don't want to ask questions where people can say yes or no, right? Because
Yeah.
they will answer in as short a way as possible to just kind of get through it. But yeah, you want to start a conversation. So Jill, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I usually go in with a set of 5 to 10 questions, and I get through maybe 3, and just in asking those 3 questions, they've answered the other 7.
That's true. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to touch on was, documenting the current workflow versus where we want to be instead, and points for optimization.
Yes.
I've noticed my experience working with lots of different companies as part of a systems integrator was that everybody thinks that they're completely unique. And as much as we all want to believe that we're all snowflakes, the fact is that creative ops has a lot of commonalities. Data projects all have a lot of commonalities and things that they can benefit from, especially when it comes to automation. So, getting people to fully document the way they have it now is crucial to knowing that where we're headed, that even though it may be more optimal and will handle more volume and scalability or personalization, whatever we're aiming for, we do need to address everything they currently have, or at least know that we're going to live without it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Should we go to the next slide? And then I think, Tig, we can answer your question as we discuss building community.
Perfect.
So Tig's asked if there are any recommendations for making sure that the introverted and or deep thinkers have a chance to weigh in during an offsite. And that's an excellent question. And I've seen it work pretty successfully. There are a couple different ways to do ideation exercises. Typically, and Jill, I think you've had this experience too, you want to break down the entire group into small tables. And you want to make sure that people aren't necessarily sitting with people that they know. But we've done everything from, we just want people to start drawing. What is your little character when you're whiteboarding? And then do some practice drawing to get into a creative headspace. Start with some fun icebreakers. I mean, there are lots of activities out there that requires that team at that table, we'll call them a mini team, to start working together. And then nobody's really left out. Post-it note exercises are great for introverts because they feel like they can say something. And even if they are super shy, they can hand their Post-it notes to somebody else at the table who will then put them up on a board. But at least it gives them a voice, even if they're not comfortable speaking. And I think for the deep thinkers, again, it's rapid fire. You don't let any exercise go on more than a few minutes to just keep the energy going, and then they can't overthink. Jill, do you have any other suggestions?
Also, round robins can work well.
Yes.
I think so. If you know who your quiet folks are, I mean, I do a lot of work with DISC. It's a kind of a behavioral, and just it predicts how people are going to interact in groups. And so you've got your dominants, you've got your influencers, you've got your steady state, and then you have your conscientious. And a couple of those types, and we all know them, and some of us are those people. They literally are waiting until the end of the meeting to make sure their question, because it might get asked by someone else, so they don't want to speak up. They are afraid of being wrong, so they don't want to speak up because they might be judged. But they also might be literally the subject matter expert in the room.
Right.
So going either a round robin where everybody gets a chance that's equal to weigh in, and where nobody's allowed to pass judgment on things that are said. Everything's a good idea. There are no bad ideas here. But placing those people in teams that are small, maybe 2 to 3 people, 4 at the most, and then having one of those be a speaker with what they came up with whatever your exercise is, then at least their voice gets heard.
Yeah, I think stating at the beginning of your offsite that it's a safe space, that no ideas are bad ideas, that everyone is supposed to come in open-minded and respectful can set a tone. And
Right.
then you have to moderate for that, right? I have found, and I've been in a lot of these ideation sessions with a lot of different kinds of groups of people, super mixed up. We didn't work for the same business unit or anything. And that's really successful. People were willing to commit to being open-minded and respectful. And I haven't seen that fail yet, but I'm sure there's there's the possibility of that. But
Yeah, I've never seen it fail either, though. But you'll want essentially each small team has its own, kind of leader or moderator within it.
yes,
The best I've ever seen is if you have enough people for each station, you actually have a moderator. You've got timekeepers that are moving everybody around,
yes,
and everybody is solving problems that they may or may not be familiar with. And then we've got
yes.
folks that are going to put it all together at the end and synthesize it, and then we come back together again and go, okay, yep, that's what we agreed on. So you typically can do this within a single day.
Yeah. And then you use the outcome of that offsite as a way to build community and to start beginning that feedback loop. So you're engaging, you're taking in feedback, you can act on that feedback, you can communicate about those actions, and then you start the process all over again.
Yeah, and it's not as small of a group as you'd think. The ones I've seen be super successful are actually about 25 people typically.
Yeah, I've seen it. It doesn't work with a super small group. Like it has to be in that 20, 25. I've also seen it work with as many as 50.
Yeah,
It
that
gets
makes sense too.
it goes a lot longer when it's 50 people than 25, but you get a lot more synergy happening where people are like, ah, yes, of course, I have that same experience. And then active problem solving starts happening right there in the room. And that is magical.
The best part is when you all come together at the end of the day, you now have 25 to 50 people in your company that are literally evangelists for your new system and project.
Exactly. It's a huge benefit to be able to get to do that and then see the success of that.
Definitely. Anything else?
So it's 6:48. I didn't have anything else about this. Did you?
No.
Okay. Should we wrap up with the last slide and then answer some questions? So as Jill and I were talking through this webinar, we realized we really need to drill in that DAM is never done. It's a continuous improvement program. It's not really even a project. Launching it is the project, but then it's ongoing. And often what we find is that executive sponsors, if they haven't been prepped correctly, think it's a one-time spend, it's a one-time thing, where it really is an ongoing program. And then just to kind of reiterate, it really is critical to have those active listening skills so that you can take in that feedback from your community and then continue iterating as part of that continuous improvement.
Yeah, it's truly never done. Do you want to talk about some of your ideas, though, on using AI and machine learning for auto tags and other things?
Sure. So, yes, I was actually just talking about that earlier today and how it's not just a plug and play. You have to train it to understand what your content is so that you get better tags, because it is a tool that will learn if you train it. Kind of like training a dog was the analogy I used earlier. You adopt a dog and the dog knows how to do dog things, but it doesn't necessarily know how to behave with humans. AI and machine learning is the same.
Yeah, I always think of dog training as it's actually training for the human on the other end of the
Yes.
leash, not the dog itself.
Exactly. And then, taking that feedback and acknowledging that you might not hit the taxonomy right out of the park, or terms change, or, additional things need to be added. You need to build it in a way that's extensible, and then acknowledge that you've heard what your stakeholders are saying and you've reacted to that. That's part of that feedback loop. Do you want to talk about tech integrations a little bit?
Sure. So one of the things to consider is whether you're doing a best of breed system versus a best in class. So when you're doing best in breed, you might be doing Adobe, for example. You might be doing an Adobe AEM DAM system, and then you're using that for all of your content production and publishing as well. There's upsides and downsides to having a single branded solution. Usually I've seen people be most successful when they do, they pick kind of the best in class. So for each piece of it that's super important to your users from a functional perspective, adopting systems that have, really open, well-documented RESTful APIs and that type of thing, I've seen be the most successful. If you are not using your internal IT group or whoever is doing your coding, if you need someone to be doing scripting and actually customizing it for you for your integration or for possibly even migrating data and that kind of thing, and content, you may want to choose a systems integrator that you find really easy to work with and that has your back. So whoever you surround yourself with, including the technologies you're picking, you don't necessarily need a technology that's 20 plus years old and super mature and proven, but you also don't necessarily need the 3 guys in the garage that have been around for only 3 months because they were cheap, right? I think there's a happy medium there.
Yeah. And sometimes if you don't have IT support, you're in a small environment, you're in a public library, sometimes even an academic library, or you're in a startup, those integration partners are really wonderful to have because they know the tools super well. And then they can continually support it because they're supporting it for other people.
Yeah. And then, whether you're going to want on-premise or cloud or hybrid or all those types, or your data center, those types of considerations will really depend on what the IT and security protocols are for your company, as well as your ability to support the system in-house versus needing, a partner that's actually providing your support.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk at all about putting together requirements and looking at different solutions?
I can in 2 minutes. Sure. So I like to think in terms of functional requirements versus technical requirements. And technical requirements are where you want IT to be involved and or a solution partner. But functional requirements are really those things that you get from your user base in terms of what they need. And so it could be things like, I need to be able to bulk upload content. I need to be able to bulk edit content. I need to be able to relate content together. I need to be able to edit one thing at a time versus several things at a time. I need to be able to create collections. What are the actions that people want to take in relationship to the content? And then build those functional requirements out. And then use those functional requirements to evaluate different vendors. And sometimes what I found is, oh, I need a DAM, I need a project management solution, I also need a CMS for distribution, I need to be able to push content out to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. So I need to understand APIs to those distribution points. And then next thing you know, it's a lot bigger than what you thought it was going to be once you start talking to your stakeholders and building out those requirements based on what their needs are. And again, to kind of circle back to what we were talking about at the beginning, but you have to make sure that you can manage to that. So that's, putting things in a scope that you can then manage to, but also knowing that you might have to find other partners to run other technologies that then can all work together in synergy. So you're building the most efficient tool set possible for your organization.
For sure. I think one of the biggest gotchas is if you know that in a year or two you're going to need, say, a PIM, like a product information management system, and it's going to have to be attached to your digital asset management system. If your DAM vendor doesn't also offer a PIM along with it, how would you plan for that, Kathleen?
So I have tended to look at the metadata fields and the taxonomy in terms of not being just for DAM, but where is that data coming from? Can I pull it downstream or from upstream from a PIM or a project management system, collect that along with the content in the DAM, or can I push it back? Those terms and metadata fields have a lot more value with the other tools. And so then you don't have to recreate the wheel, right? You've done a lot of the hard thinking and the planning and execution. So leverage that so that you're not having to duplicate data entry, right?
Right. And also having intelligent connectors between your systems
Yeah.
that only pass the right amount of data back and forth is critical for both speed, efficiency, and your search, again, your search functionality.
Yeah. So think broadly and try to think in terms of how flexible can you build this so that A, it's extensible for your DAM, but also for the potential of including other tools in your tool stack.
Do we have time for a couple questions?
Sure, we've got 3 minutes.
Okay. Kathleen, I was curious, you mentioned that you send out a weekly newsletter. What kind of information do you put in that?
Usually I put in a summary of new content that I've got in the DAM. And then I put out any new features that have been deployed by the vendor or that I know are coming that have been asked for. So I give people an update on, what's new and what's coming. And that's part of that feedback loop, right? I've been listening to what their needs are. I've spoken to the vendor's told me X, and then I will track that in my weekly newsletter with them, along with what all the new content is. I will also flag if I know critical content is expiring because the rights are expiring to give forewarning. I also let them know when I'm going on vacation so that I don't have 400 emails when I come back. So.
That's great. I've also seen key partners highlighted depending on how they're using our content, or like her example earlier, takeover of Times Square for a large launch or things like that. How did that go? What did we learn from it?
And I'm also curious if either of you send out surveys to users and stakeholders. And if you do, if you have any survey strategies that you design into them.
10 or less questions can only take 5 minutes or less.
Yes. And then you can expect more than 25 to 30% response rate. So that is usually considered successful in a large organization. I have found that the surveys in large orgs tend to be less successful than me showing up to team meetings and asking the same 5 questions I would ask in the survey.
So both qualitative and quantitative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, and then one last question, because we have a minute. What is the biggest problem that you've each encountered deploying a DAM, and how did you address that problem?
Ooh.
I know it's a big question to throw in right at the end.
It is. So for me, it was not understanding how the content was going to be reported out on, right? So early in my career, I didn't think about that. I was just going. This is the content. Here are, metadata schemas I'll be using. Here's, some rights management information, structure. And then it's like, oh crap, a senior leadership person actually needs these other data points for their annual report to board members or something. It hadn't even occurred to me to talk more to a broader stakeholder base. And so my learnings were talk to as many people as possible, figure out who your champions are, who's going to sit on a steering committee, and help it constantly advise you. Because often we get dumped into a DAM role and then we're swimming as fast as we can and not really being able to see the shore, right? So acknowledge that there are people out there that want to help you, and you just find them. And don't think you're just a sole contributor, even though you may be the person in charge of your dam. You're not the only one accessing that content, right?
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think the biggest issues I've seen are either data that we didn't migrate because we didn't know it was there because it was in an ancillary system that only fed at certain rates and times, and then the other piece is there's a user or some use case that was a corner case but critical, and we missed it because we didn't have conversations with those people. So having as broad of exposure and conversations as possible is a key to success.
Yes, and building for flexibility in the event you need to migrate, right?
For sure. And then do we want to go to the last slide to put a ping in for our next second webinar in the series? Yeah, so next time we're going to pull a rabbit out of a hat, and we want you to join us for the magic of change management, where we will talk more about integrating humans, processes, and technology.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been great. And to everyone who attended, thank you. I am going to be sending out a survey that will be 10 questions or less to see how you liked this. And I hope that we'll see you again on the next round on February 12th.
All right, thank you so much for having us here. It's been super fun.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.